Yeah, hi everyone. I'm just Maciek. I'm super happy to see you all here, and I'm super happy to see a lot of great minds here to gather at this panel. And as I think, like the previous session and some of the sessions yesterday were a great build-up for what we're about to discuss today with my great guests. And I don't have those nice, shiny, and boring introductions to you, but when I was thinking about who would be or who are the best people to invite to the session about those possible pathways between animal welfare advocacy and plant-based alternative protein campaigning, Mahi was the first person that I came up with, because I'm really impressed by their work, even though they are not like very shiny and loud in the media. So that was an easy goal. And then I asked Josh Bolk about a recommendation for another speaker. Hence, he's like, I think like he's doing quite interesting things in both spheres. And he recommended Karla from Humane Society US, Karla Pignotti, if I'm not mistaken. And here we are. And yeah, you know why I invited you to the panel. But I had this idea that maybe you suggest or you present yourselves and tell a bit about what you've been up to, what is your profile, what's your background as well. So you can now make this kind of shiny and nice presentation of yourselves in a couple of minutes. Hopefully less boring than mine. Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Well, first of all, thank you all so much. It's such a privilege to be up here with both of you, and thank you all for coming, and for those tuning in virtually, really appreciate it. Very excited about the conversation. So I am the Vice President of Farm Animal Protection with the Humane Society of the United States, and I've been working with HSUS for about 10 years now. Prior to the role that I'm in, I was leading our plant-based initiatives for many years. And speaking to prior joining HSUS, I have a slightly different journey than maybe some of the individuals in the room. I actually spent another decade working in the food industry, the industry that we are working with on these various campaigns. So I would say my journey kind of started when I was a child, and I would say the first memory I have is understanding how a hot dog is made, and it immediately as a child made me realize I did not want to eat any beef or pork, and then in high school became vegetarian, and thank you. And in college, when I was pursuing dietetics and nutrition, became vegan. So after my schooling, I worked for 10 years in the state of Florida with one of the largest school districts, operating 50 schools there on nutrition education and menu planning and purchasing. And we actually implemented a Meatless Monday initiative, and that's how I became familiar with what HSUS does around plant-based initiatives. Just happened that they were hiring a dietitian, and I knew that aligned with a lot of my personal beliefs and professional goals. So long story short, that's how I ended up here. And on a personal note, throughout the years, I've certainly been involved in a lot of companion animal rescue and fostering, and then about 7 years ago, founded my own farmed animal sanctuary. So when I'm not working on the issues we're talking about today, I am caring for 80 rescued farm animals on my property.
Lovely. Mahi. And a round of applause for Karla, come on.
Hey, I was born in 1979.
Still alive.
Still alive, somehow. Despite being vegan, I'm still all right, more or less. We can skip a couple of years on my journey to 2005, actually, where I read Gandhi, the short autobiography. And there was a scene where he describes being very sick, and his British doctors were like, hey, Gandhi, you gotta eat some chicken soup or you will die. That was kind of the medicine back then, the kind of knowledge they had. And Gandhi was like, yeah, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. Either way, I won't eat chicken soup. I'd rather die myself than have an animal die for me. And that kind of got me thinking a little bit. And I basically went vegetarian on the spot. 1 month later, I was like, what's wrong with all these vegans? Why don't they... Well, there were not a lot of vegans. What's wrong with the 2 vegans in Germany? Why don't they eat organic eggs or drink organic milk? And then I found out what's happening in those industries, and I kind of became vegan number 3 in Germany back then. And like I was an angry vegan for like maybe the first year or first half year, and
The angry vegan, right?
Angry. Yeah, imagine me being angry. So me being angry meant sending Peter newsletters to all of my friends and annoying them with that stuff. And luckily, I realized that this is not working at all. So I thought of more effective strategies to help animals. And then our paths kind of crossed through Josh Borg. I got to know Josh, and he was back then running at HSUS the cage-free campus campaign, where he got together with students, universities to switch to cage-free eggs. And I was like, hey, this is something maybe I could be doing. That's how I got involved in activism. I started that in Germany. Then met the founder of Schweitzer Foundation, became part of that. And the rest is history. We're now a team of 34 people. And I'm happy to say that we have some impact in Germany on both welfare reforms and also on plant-based eating.
And a bit in Poland as well, up until now.
And not anymore, yes, yeah. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, as you said, like...
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that was a nice personal introduction, but as we get to the grind, I would like to start with something that is nice and cozy. So, you've been both doing and championing like impactful work for farmed animals. And before we get to this animal welfare / plant-based protein mashup, maybe you can share like one recent intervention or project campaign that you think was particularly impactful in your work, whatever, if it's plant-based or welfare. That would be like maybe nice introduction to the rest of the discussion. Go on, Mahi.
I'd say quite recently, just a couple of weeks ago, it feels like we got the second one of the big supermarket chains in Germany. We have 4 really big ones to commit to the chicken ask, so broiler chicken ask we have in Germany. And in terms of numbers of animals and the amount of suffering that will be reduced, I think that's maybe one of the top 3 victories we ever had in Germany. So it's really meaningful, and I think it will help us get past that tipping point where we are getting towards a majority of the industry wanting to switch to higher welfare chicken standards. And I'm really excited about that.
Cool. Karla?
Yeah, and I'll probably add a little bit to that because I'm not sure that everyone in the room is aware of exactly kind of the areas that HSUS has been working on when it comes to this. But everyone is... Just really quickly, certainly what we have focused on for many years is abolishing the use of cages and crates, as well as simultaneously reducing the number of animals that are born into factory farms. So our work is guided by these missions and the vision there. So in thinking about it, we have legislative welfare reform, we have corporate welfare reform, and then we work on plant-based and meat reduction initiatives. I would say certainly from a legislative standpoint, we have made it illegal in 15 states to banning at least one of the following forms of extreme confinement. So we know battery cages, veal crates, or gestation crates. Most notably, you're probably familiar with the Proposition 12 that passed in California several years ago. Just last year, the Supreme Court upheld that, which was a massive victory for HSUS and the many organizations involved. And certainly we'll talk more about corporate and plant-based, but I would say another thought there when it comes to our plant-based work, we've been working on this for over over a decade and really looking at evolving our strategies. And the last few years, we had a solidified ask of focusing on food service management companies to get to 50% plant-based menus. And I know I'll talk more about that, but at the end of last year, we've been able to shift over 2.8 billion meals to plant-based because of that work.
Cool. That deserves a round of applause, I guess. Why not? Yeah, both Mahi and Karla, you all work with a lot of companies, institutions, food services operators to adopt like strong policies for the animals. In your experience, what are the main drivers for those entities to move towards better animal protection in the industry, on the institutional level? And maybe you can come up with some examples of how companies benefit. So what's the value for the companies from implementing strong animal welfare policies? And I will follow up with a question, did those include anything related with like alternative protein advocacy? Yeah,
you're looking at me?
Can you start?
Yeah, so the first question was, why are these companies even talking to us, and why are they sometimes...
You also have a pretty peculiar or like unusual strategy, so maybe you can talk a bit more.
Yeah.
You're not that loud with Albert Schweitzer.
Yeah, I think in Germany, if you live in Germany, you will hear of our work quite a bit, I hope at least. Internationally, maybe not so. But yes, we are maybe working quite a bit more behind the scenes than some other organizations. I would say we were the first group to actually bring corporate outreach to Germany. It just did not happen before we got involved. So we have some first mover advantage. We were the first group to reach out to companies. And I think over time, we were able to build quite a track record in terms of having knowledge, being available, having a dedicated team, being always there when companies want to talk to us. And obviously, we would always reach out to ask for meetings, either if we have a certain topic we want to discuss with them, or just to keep the relationship going and discuss where people are. So why are the companies actually doing sometimes what we ask them to do? I think that's kind of there's a blurry...
Are they scared?
Maybe two. I remember I was in one meeting where it was the first meeting with that company, and there were also some junior people in the room who were not really trained in working with NGOs. It was really easy to see. And one of them said, well, one of the reasons we have you here today is because we don't want you to start a campaign against us. And this was like her internal briefing she shared with me, very obviously. And I thought it was quite interesting. And but that's kind of not our main approach. We're not threatening companies usually. That's kind of our last resort to launch a campaign if we just don't get anywhere with constructive dialogue. And I think what we do is we show companies that we don't just want them to change, we want to change the entire industry. So it's not economic disadvantage we want to put them in. And that we actually give them the chance to be a first mover and build their brand, build their reputation, show their customers that they're actually doing something on these issues. And I think it's kind of a mix. It also depends very much on the individual decision makers in the companies, whether they care about the issues or not, whether they need a push or whether they actually want to help change the industry. And we see all of that. So I think it's important to understand who you're talking to, what their goals are, what their interests are, and kind of cater your message to them and figure out ways to create win-win situations. I think that's always what we have in mind, and I think companies value that when we talk to them.
And did any of those welfare wins had any traces of like plant-based work or like plant-based advocacy or progress?
It's actually now leading to that. So over many years, we built strong relationships basically only with animal welfare work. We would ask for maybe more vegan products, which thinking back was probably not the most effective ask we could have come up with. But just having these relationships and being able to switch between topics and bringing new topics, it was very natural for us to say, hey, we want to talk to you also about meat reduction or the protein balance in your supply chain and how to tilt that towards plant-based. And once the companies themselves started working more and more on their CO2 equivalents and their kind of emissions they are responsible for directly, but also the emissions their suppliers are responsible for, scope 3 emissions, we kind of told them, hey, also look at your suppliers, try to understand the big picture here. Scope 3 is kind of the insider term. And we kind of, I think, helped a little bit those companies to see the bigger picture and to really understand that when they want to reduce CO2 equivalents, meat and dairy and animal products in general are very important to look at. So now we are starting to get big corporates signing NDAs with us or agreeing with us to work on this topic and work on meat reduction as well.
Cool. Karla?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Mahi said. For HSUS, we have a very similar style in how we work with companies at both the welfare reform and more of the meat reduction plant-based. I would say when we look at companies that have the strongest policies, whether it's, and again, we usually did start with welfare reform as well. If they have strong policies there, they're going to most likely be the ones that have the strongest plant-based policies as well. I know we're going to dive deeper into that in the conversation, but just thinking about that, and oftentimes the companies are aligning their vision and mission with these policies and the importance of following through with them because customers are demanding that transparency as well. And if they don't follow through, it's running the risk of the brand's reputation. So just one example in thinking about that when it comes to, the reform and plant-based products from a consumer packaged goods, Unilever. They make Hellmann's and Best Food mayonnaise. They not only had a cage-free commitment, they also developed a plant-based mayo. Ben & Jerry's, who's also owned by Unilever, they also followed through with their cage-free commitment and were the first national brand to create a plant-based ice cream as well. And by all means, seems to be very successful as they're continuing to expand the flavors there. So just one example there.
Yeah, both of your opinions and statements kind of resonate what I think like Toby said yesterday on the effective campaigning panel, that it might be that it's good that companies don't hate us because we might work with them in the future on different asks, different fields. And well, like it naturally resonates with me, but I know that there are like different opinions on that. But coming to the core, if we were to give a general answer, can our pathways cross? Can we walk together, the plant-based advocates and the welfare campaigners, the chicken and the broiler people? Can we work together? Can we?
Sure.
Yeah, go on.
Sure. Well, in general, short answer, yes, absolutely.
Yes. Why? How?
We're certainly doing that. We've seen a lot of success with that over many years. I think for the sake of repeating myself, what we see in the United States, at least, is that the companies that have been willing to work with us and are moving forward on and making good on their welfare policies are also very open to and talking about plant-based policies and have been for many years. So we're seeing that naturally that conversation goes together. We've been building the relationships with a lot of these companies for many years, many times decades, in talking with them on this. So it's something that naturally comes to fruition in the conversation there, and they make the connection. They understand why we're talking about both of those issues, and they have been willing to move forward on both of those conversations from organizations as well. I used Unilever as an example, but in the US, when it comes to US grocery retailers, Whole Foods and Sprouts, both really great examples of companies that are doing well there. And on the food service management side, and I know I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but companies like Aramark and Sodexo US and Bon Appetit, they're all very strong on both sides as well.
And what if it doesn't work? I mean, like, what if the companies are not pushing forward neither of your asks? Do you have like any? What would you put as a priority? Maybe. Oh, that would be the interesting take.
Yeah.
Welfare or plant-based?
Well, I would say from our standpoint, we have been working much longer on the specific ask when it comes to the welfare reform. So many of the companies have had these commitments in place for a long time, and it's more of pushing them to follow through and continuing with that, where more recently, while we have been working on plant-based for many years, the similar commitment or the ask that we have been making of the companies has happened in the last 4 years. So that's something that is certainly newer and that we're continuing to work on with these companies there. So I would say from a US standpoint, the reform has been the start of the conversation, and I would say the plant-based meat reduction side is the newer part of the conversation for the majority of the companies.
Mahi?
Yeah, so can our pathways cross? So now I have to say no, I guess. But only because I think they're parallel. They cannot cross because they're parallel. It just works hand in hand. And I don't see any conflict at all. And to answer your question, what would we choose? I think that really depends on the individual situation. We're always looking for progress. And that's the number one priority. So we don't have a priority whether we want to do welfare or meat reduction. The priority is progress, so that just depends on the individual company. Sometimes maybe we have the right people, the right motivation, the right strategy being in place now for that company to work on meat reduction with us, and maybe it's welfare reforms for another company. So it's just whatever pushes the peanut forward.
Mm-hmm. And what happens, or where do we step on each other's foot, or is there a conflict of interest that might occur in any of those areas of work that we are talking about?
Yeah, it sometimes happens. So, for instance, unfortunately, we felt we had no other solution than to launch a campaign against Lidl on the topic of broiler chickens. Because we felt our normal talks were not going anywhere. And in the meantime, Lidl developed a nice strategy to increase their plant-based proteins and to really measure that and set goals for that, reduce the prices of plant-based products to get parity to animal products. And I and we as a team would have loved to work with Lidl on that, but we were not able to because we were running that broiler campaign. So it does happen that some things get in the way. But having said that, we typically don't run more than 1 or 2 campaigns at once. And we work with hundreds of companies. So usually we don't have conflicts like these.
Karla?
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, certainly we have the situations where we have run to the end with a company in terms of negotiations or other strategies. And for example, right now we are running a campaign against Target because of their lack of follow through with many of their welfare reform commitments there. So certainly it's, those are some of the challenges, but I would say oftentimes we don't run into a lot of those issues. If there are those concerns, especially with the companies that we are working very closely on plant-based, because we take a hands-on approach and provide a lot of technical assistance with the companies that are making those plant-based menu changes. So we're in regular contact, working very closely, establishing pretty strong relationships there. So if there are challenges, oftentimes it can be resolved through negotiations, further discussions as well. I would say if we're talking about some of the dynamics or challenges with other NGOs or other organizations.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. How does it look like if there's no alignment on targets with other NGOs or activists?
Yeah, I think, and I'll touch on this quickly, and then certainly Mahi, if you want to add to it. But I would say what we see as an issue on both sides is when other NGOs, we have similar, targets that we're addressing with companies. And if we can't be aligned as much as possible on the ask, that makes it very challenging. I will say, stepping on the other side, when I was working in the food industry and I was receiving a lot of those conversations on that end, if I was receiving information or different asks, oftentimes it would kind of be like, well, I'm not going to necessarily listen to X because Y and Z are doing something else and they're not going to be satisfied with the change. So I'm just not going to address it altogether. And so then it's a lose-lose situation for what we want to have happen. So the importance of, whenever possible, aligning our asks.
Mahi?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we have gotten better as a movement to do that. We saw some events where an NGO would be willing to accept something that would be less than other groups were asking for, and companies made use of that. And that made the more ambitious NGOs angry, understandably. But I think those problems, to a large degree, have been resolved. And very recently, just a couple of days ago, we saw a tiny example. I don't think it was very problematic. Aldi, one of the large retailers in Germany, put out a press release also quoting us, like we were partnering with them on this, that they're now measuring their share of plant-based and animal-based foods in their supply chain, and the revenue, and this kind of being step one to setting goals and then increasing the plant-based share of everything. And we were like softly, gently applauding that, not going over the top because goals were still missing. But another group came in, and that's public, so I can just say the name, ProVeg. I saw a statement saying, well, that's nice, but it's not enough. And so ProVeg was pushing a little harder than we were, but that's fine. We were not kind of in odds with each other. Sorry. And then, of course, there's kind of the other side, the abolitionist versus welfare reformist, or like incremental step organizations. I think also as a movement, we kind of matured. I don't see that as such a big problem anymore. And I think part of it is that we are talking more to each other, understanding our approaches, seeing the data that actually welfare reforms and meat reduction usually go hand in hand in countries. So it's maybe not that much at odds as we used to think in the past. So I'm quite happy about the progress we're making as a movement.
Cool. Mahi, again, back to you. Germany is a pioneer in both welfare and plant-based developments. There was a question about like meat production and meat consumption reduction in Germany recently, and I think like across Europe at least you have the most progressive welfare laws being implemented. So it's both visible on like governmental level, official data, market level. It looks like those two advancements happen in parallel. I would say it could be considered the same in UK, which also have a strong welfare and quite a well-developed plant-based market, and also some trends in reduction of meat consumption. Maybe you can give a bit of context, and why so? Why do you think like Germany is the pioneer in both?
Yeah, I get this a lot, the question, and I made some notes seeing this coming. So first question is maybe, why is Germany relatively good on animal welfare? And I would, just to be clear, say we are nowhere near the goal. We're nowhere near animals not suffering anymore. Like, there's still a lot going wrong.
Still plenty of work.
Yeah, for decades, unfortunately. But I think in general, we can say people in Germany care about animals and have a general understanding of what factory farming is. There have been a lot of undercover investigations in the media. So people get the sense they do care about this. They want to see progress. Animal welfare is part of the constitution. So it's officially part of the job of the government to take care of animals or to increase welfare standards. We have some really good court rulings that help us advance animal welfare standards. We have had a lot of successful corporate outreach happening, and the governments tend to implement those victories. Unfortunately, they don't lead the way, but when they see larger changes, they kind of implement that into the law. So I think that covers the animal welfare side. And then why is Germany relatively good on meat reduction, plant-based? And I think there are many reasons, and they all have they're like each a piece of the puzzle, and I probably won't list all pieces of the puzzle here, but here are some. More and more people get the general idea that meat consumption and animal product consumption are not good for the health, for the environment, for the animals. So there's kind of a shift happening. Almost everyone claims to reduce meat consumption. It's like, yeah, I don't eat a lot of meat. You hear that all the time, but over the last 5 to 7 years, we see people taking more and more action actually in that direction. So meat consumption has been on decline for quite a while. Every year, we especially see young people eat less and less meat, and the share of vegetarians and vegans is especially high in younger people. That may have to do with movements like Fridays for Futures, where meat consumption is kind of at least one of the issues they talk about. We have the environmental groups in Germany that have really embraced the idea that meat consumption and production are just not good for their goals either. And it took them a while to dare speaking out about this. They at first were very scared of losing supporters, but now it's very normal for environmental NGOs to speak about these issues and to push governments or companies on these issues. Some political parties have embraced the message, so that is happening. We see more and more alternatives available in the supermarkets and restaurants. They're getting better by the year, basically. So all of this, I think, is combining to now we have a trend of, I think, around 7 years of declining meat consumption and production.
So what's there to learn?
What's there to learn? Yeah, I think some are just very interlinked. And as I said, and as we said, basically for the entire panel, this stuff goes hand in hand together very nicely. And it's kind of when people care about animals, they understand that eating animals is not a good idea. They kind of, maybe not to the extent we want them to follow up on this, but they are starting to follow up on this and choosing more vegetarian, vegan dishes or reducing the portion sizes of meat in their dishes. So all of these are like good effects, and this has something to do with people caring about animals and the environment and their health. Yeah, so I don't have the perfect answer, but like what I can see is this just going super well together.
Maybe one follow-up question that just came to my mind. Do you have like do you as Albert Schweitzer Foundation have a strong support from, let's say, like vegan groups or like vegan communities in Germany as an organization?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of our supporters are vegans on social media, followers, most of them, or a large chunk of them are vegans. We are very much making sure that we include everyone, like everyone who cares about the issue. We want to see them being able to play a role in achieving our mission. So I think that's also important, at least that when you look at the entire ecosystem of NGOs, you should have some NGOs that are like very integrative in terms of getting everyone on board. And I don't think it hurts to have more, let's say, radical organizations who say, hey, if you really care about animals, go vegan. I think that message is totally fair and it should be said.
So do you appeal to the grown-up vegans? Yesterday it was said that like grown-up groups are, let's say, more prone to, let's say, like incremental welfare work and so on. Or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of mix both. Like we explain why we do welfare work. We also help people going vegan, and we also help people going every step along the way of becoming a vegan. So I don't think that any of this is exclusive. I think it should be inclusive.
Sure. Yeah. Karla, one of the major wins that HSUS mentions on your website is that 20 of the 50 top food service companies in the US have said that public plant-based menu and meat reduction goals after working with you guys and folks. Can you share a bit more about that and how did you get to that? It seems like a massive win.
Yeah, so our plant-based work has been going on for nearly a decade as well. And I think, looking back at this and what we try to do as an organization, I'm sure all of you do this as well, is constantly looking to evaluate the effectiveness of the work that we're doing, the strategies, the tactics that we're looking at. So several years ago, actually right before the pandemic, probably not the best timing if we knew, but we really shifted the way that we were approaching our plant-based work and really targeting the food service management companies or caterers in the United States, and many of them are global as well. So these companies are servicing, tens of thousands of accounts, schools, hospitals, colleges and universities, corporate cafeterias, stadiums, anywhere where there's large gatherings. They're serving meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, oftentimes 7 days a week. So the overall impact is really large in thinking on that. And prior to this, we had been doing a lot of work. Most of our work is around the culinary side, and we had not been asking companies to set commitments similar to the welfare pledges. So we started doing that, and that's where the 50% ask came in. And part of that was because we were not getting a lot of purchasing data from companies to verify or track the work, but what we could track is menu changes, and knowing that could lead to more. So that was how we moved that strategy. And a part of the strategy for getting so many of those companies on board right away was we also implemented a scorecard that would track and rank the companies based on their plant-based progress. And we've been doing that for 3 years now as well, and getting companies to make that. One interesting point, if you're familiar with the United States, there's a company called Fresh Ideas. They're a mid-level company, but they were actually the first company to get on board with committing to 50% plant-based by 2025. And what's interesting about them is they're based in the Midwest, so very rural, high agriculture, meat and potatoes, still thinking on that. So the fact that they
just left potatoes.
Yeah, right. Emphasis on the meat, yeah. But it was really interesting that they were the first of all the companies to sign on and make that pledge. Another interesting note was Sodexo USA. Sodexo Global does have a 33% plant-based goal, so a third of their menus, which was outside of the work with our organization. But in the US, they have their college and university is one of their largest segments, over 400 college and universities that they represent. A couple years ago when we were having the conversation with them, they said, absolutely no way we're going to be making a plant-based pledge. We'll continue to work with you on it. So we came up with, okay, well, every university that participates in a culinary training with us has to sign the pledge. So there was some tracking, some commitment. Less than a year later, the whole segment did end up signing a pledge. And then less than a year later, they signed on and increase their pledge to 50%, which they'll reach 50% by the end of this year, which is really exciting there.
Do you track it? Or
yes. So that's through the scorecard. So the scorecard asks them about, their various plant-based goals, implementation practices. It is self-reported, but what we do to verify that information, and that part isn't published, but it's verified through us. We ask them to send in supplemental purchasing data, other verification purposes, so we can confidently share that what is published in our scorecard for those companies is in fact accurate, and it's not just us taking the company's word that those are the changes that are being made. We need that verification as well. So that's also helped with tracking of our own internal progress and really evolving that particular process.
Yeah, I think the next question kind of will allow you to dive a bit deeper into your impact on animals precisely. Well, the evidence that plant-based outreach, plant-based advocacy on the corporate level or on the individual level helps animals suffer less isn't that strong compared to the welfare approach, where we can assess our impact more precisely. To what extent do you compare various interventions with each other, and how do you do it, if you do? Maybe I can just briefly share that we at Anima recently, especially our friends in France, recently stopped a campaign that was perceived as very successful, working with public canteens helping them introduce vegetarian meals when they found out that actually it turns out to more suffering because of possibly more eggs being used and possibly more white meat being used in the pledges of the canteens. So, yeah, Mahi, maybe you can start.
Yeah, there's this very nerdy way of examining how many animals are there of each species, how big is their suffering, and then have identify different types of suffering, like annoying, from annoying to really crucial and extremely painful, and kind of come up with a score. And then you have like a suffering score and for different species, and then you come up with interventions and you estimate your chance of winning and you pick like the highest expected value. And I do think there is value in this nerdy approach. Not trying to diss it here, but I think it should be complemented by an approach that is very much hands-on in terms of let's pick some low-hanging fruits, even if that's not the hugest amount of suffering we can reduce, because that will just help us build momentum. For instance, we had one case where large supermarket chains came to us and said, "Hey, we want to work on with you on dairy cows, dairy cow welfare." And we were like, "Nah, we are EA. We're doing the broilers, we're doing the fishies. You should be doing that too. Like, don't do dairy cows. It's not that many animals. The suffering is not that big." And I think that was a huge mistake, actually, and that was my mistake. I made that decision because I was too much in that EA mindset. And looking back now, I think we should have invested some resources, because that would have allowed us to build stronger relationship with these companies. The companies being more used to working with us, doing what we suggest they should be doing. And that just helps you build momentum and influence. And that is a huge part of the equation. So looking back, I think we should have actually done that work, even though on paper it wouldn't have been like an extreme amount of suffering reduced. And I think some of our funders would have asked critical questions about it, but I think it still would have been the right way to do things. So to sum it up, we are influenced by this nerdy EA thinking to quite some degree, but also we're very pragmatic and we want to build momentum, we want to build influence. And when you build momentum, you get more supporters, you get more donors, you get more people who are willing to get engaged. And if that happens through like cute animals or animals they can emphasize with, like a dairy cow, a lot of people just can emphasize more with a cow than with a chicken or a fish. Let's just make use of this stuff. And I think if you look at the long-term approach over a couple of decades, that always optimized approach will actually be superior to an always optimized approach of optimizing numbers all the time.
Are we as a movement too much focused on optimizing approach?
I think the EA bubble, or some of it might be. It's kind of my impression that sometimes it's very data driven, and that again is really good and important to have. But then there's an overall decision to be made, and that's made in the real world. Where like the huge majority of the world is not EA driven. Decision makers in companies are not EA driven. Donors, most of them are not EA driven. So that should just all feed in, and you can get nerdy about that too, I guess, and come up with a new nerdy EA approach that kind of incorporates all of that and have a number that tells you what I just suggested might have the highest number, expected value kind of number. But yeah, sometimes I think there's too much focus on interventions that in some cases actually can get you laughed out of the room. And that happened too. Again, a mistake I made, too much influenced by EA. Insects were kind of the hot topic, and we hadn't yet figured out how to work best on insects. I think we got smarter along the way, but I was like, all right, let's do the EA thing. Go into these corporate meetings and say, hey, we want to talk about insect suffering with you. And we want you to have a policy not to sell any insects. And that was, back in the days, that was kind of the fear that supermarkets would start selling insects to end consumers, which didn't happen. And they were like, you want to talk about what? Sorry, I have a meeting. And no, it was like really weird, and it just didn't work out at all. And again, I think you need to be smart about how you approach these things. I'm not saying working on insects is wrong. I'm just saying the way we try to do it, or I try to do it, just didn't work out.
Yeah, it's all about like being down to earth and on the ground with how people perceive things. Yeah. Karla, do you want to comment on that kind of assessment thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to what Mahi shared and thinking about that from our perspective, certainly you need that kind of data and the information to drive strategy. And with my organization, we are pretty hyper-focused with those three main areas that I spoke about. But I would agree that if there are opportunities or companies approach us and we have the resources, we can help support that. It's only going to benefit our cause overall because it's going to create that relationship, build on that trust further as well. So I think, one piece of it that we've really looked at from the plant-based side is how best to track our impact there in thinking about that. And that's why we, again, did move to more of the shift with the menus, because companies are tracking and looking at purchasing data, meat reduction, and they're just not always willing to share that information with us. We're working with their competitors and they don't necessarily trust us. So over the time, the relationships have evolved, but looking at menus was a way that we could track it based also on the limited research that's out there in terms of those shifts and those changes. So I would just say that, yes, I think we need to find a balance between the two, and it's really important. And the theme for what we've been talking about for this time as well is that we need both interventions to work and walk that way parallel.
Yeah, it's a question that I haven't put on a script, but just came up to my mind. Often-wise, plant-based campaigners use the climate angle, the climate change, the carbon emissions angle, encouraging retailers, companies to shift towards more sustainable plant-based diets, but it might be understood also as shifting from beef to chicken, which is possibly doing a lot of harm to the animals. How do you ensure that it doesn't happen in your areas of work? Or do you think about it, or it's a kind of a question that you said that maybe we're too much nerdy about that? Yeah, Mahi?
I wouldn't say that one we're too nerdy about. It's on our minds a lot. I have the observation that it used to be more of an issue in the past. I think now we get to work with companies who really understand that they have to decrease meat for all species in all categories. And this is something we're striving for. And also there, the welfare reforms can come in very handy. So we are working a lot on broiler welfare reforms. So when companies implement those reforms, that makes the broiler meat more expensive. And that is an incentive to reduce the amount of broiler meat in the supply chains, or customers just will buy a little less of it. And you can also get nerdy about that. There's price elasticities you can look at, and economists do that. So there's some evidence that this stuff can actually work hand in hand quite well if you play it nicely.
Karla?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of conversation, as that comes up with companies, we're very clear in the conversations that we have. If climate change, and oftentimes that is the driver for most of the companies making these changes, at least in the US, in the policies themselves. So we're very clear with that. I think where the confusion can come in, or the questions, or maybe the pain points, is when there are, let's say, environmental orgs that are working with these same companies and maybe don't have that same vision or aligned ask, is where some of the challenges can come in.
And I have one addition. I think it's super important what gets measured. And luckily in Germany, and I think also across the world now, there's what gets measured is the protein mix, or the mix between animal-based and plant-based. So it's less CO2 measurement and more protein mix measurement. And that's really crucial, because what gets measured gets done, is what like managers often say. And I think that is very promising, and it shows us that we don't need to worry too much right now about this. If they would shift more to a CO2 measurement, I would be a lot more worried. But what we've seen over the last year or so is a drastic shift towards these protein mix measures. So that's really
in the progressive countries.
yes.
My idea for the second part of our discussion was to talk a bit more on what I call the day-to-day operations and having like all of your and also our organization Anima International do both welfare and plant-based advocacy. And I wanted to ask you a bit about like teams and people. And I would like to start with Karla, since you're the great example of a person who shifted from one area to another. Can you tell a bit more about the experience of moving campaigners between plant-based and welfare campaigns one way or another? Does it work? What is hard? What doesn't work? Karla.
Well, I hope it works because I'm going to use myself as the example. But yes, I would say as a whole, at least speaking for my organization on the United States, as well as my counterparts with HSI and those that are in country offices, some of our country offices, we have one individual working. So in those times, absolutely, they have to switch between the conversations and have that as well. But speaking to my example, as I shared earlier, prior to about several years ago, I was pretty much leading the plant-based work, had been in that space for most of my professional life in talking about that, and just recently moved into more of the taking over and leading the welfare reform. And the good thing, at least from our perspective in my organization and working with companies, is that much of the discussion, the asks, while they're, they are different asks, the way we go about it and what we're asking companies to do are very similar with the process. So I would say that while we are fortunate to have campaigners to work on the separate issues, we have oftentimes with myself and others had that crossover, and it's been very successful.
Mahi?
Yeah, for me and for us, it's important that companies don't have to switch between individuals a lot. So if in a company there's one person covering animal welfare and plant-based, I want to make sure that they have one person to talk to, maybe a specialist or two who can give more details on certain topics. But I would try to avoid situations where we would have two people trying to build relationships with one person in one company. I don't think that would be a good setup. So for us, it's important that all the people who do corporate outreach can talk about animal welfare and also on about meat reduction.
Is it somehow related with the fact that your brand as an organization is quite like, let's say, agnostic even with the branding and the name? It's not really associated with strong animal rights message.
Yeah, maybe to some degree. I think, though, if an organization is working on both, they should always try to mirror the structure of the companies they work with. So I'd say even if our name was Animal Welfare Foundation, we would still have the same setup that if there's one person in one company to talk to, we should have one person on our side. And also, if possible, mirror their hierarchy a little bit, because in some companies we see it that our specialists often talk to the specialist of the company. And then if we want to talk to the boss, sometimes the bosses will talk to our specialists too. Sometimes they will be like a little bit picky and want to at least have some kind of contact with our director of corporate outreach. And even higher up the hierarchy, sometimes the CEOs or the managing directors of buying, they prefer talking to me. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. And I don't see that, I think, in a lot of groups, that all the way through the hierarchy up to ED, CEO, president, there's somebody willing and able to talk to companies and to the key players there. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because it can be super effective to have these high-level conversations, maybe just once a year, but to really agree on the pathway. And we've seen that over and over again, that, for instance, I would talk to a managing director at a company, and then the emails we get in the following weeks are very much inspired by that conversation and that managing director making sure the team understands what we talked about and then pushing things forward. So this for me would be like a little bit, I wouldn't call it a hack, but it's kind of a setup to keep in mind when you build your organization and you take corporate outreach seriously, that you mirror that hierarchy of companies.
I think that's brilliant. Really cool insight. Another day-to-day operations question, the funding. We all know that there are different funders, different donors, that some of them fund both plant-based advocacy and welfare. Some of the donors prefer one way or another and have like strong opinions on either of sides. How do you work in your organizations with getting funding for your work, Karla?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, really since the inception of our farm animal protection department, we've been working on both of the issues. So we have funders that are donating just generally to across the board all of the campaigns. And then much like the discussions we're having today and throughout the conference, there are some donors, just like organizations, that are preferring to put their funding to one lane or the other. And we very much have that. Certainly we respect that and want their donations to go to what is most important and meaningful for them with the outcomes that they want to see. So we have a mix of both.
Mahi?
Luckily, most of our funders give for general purposes. We had some conversations with a large funder who was skeptical of doing plant-based work, meat reduction work, based on some experience in the US. And I explained that I think it's important to invest a small portion of our budget in building these relationships, start talking about the issue. And to me, the only way of really getting somewhere is to combine both approaches, so welfare and plant-based / meat reduction. And luckily, they didn't mind. So even though they said, we'd kind of prefer you to focus on welfare, if you kind of say, okay, it's a small portion of your time and energy and money, and you want to try to build something there, we don't really mind it. And I think that paid huge dividends over time, because in the beginning, when we started, we didn't have that much to show for. We kind of built our toolkit. We started reaching out to companies. Directions were mixed. Not a lot of companies wanted to work on with this on us. We were maybe a little bit too ambitious on having immediate results. So we were pushing companies to set up goals with us. They had zero experience working on this topic. So they were like, we want to start working on it, but we can't set goals right now. It's too much at once. And luckily that funder stayed patient. And now, as I mentioned, one of the large retailers just came out saying, we're measuring this stuff. We want to increase the plant-based side of things. And I doubt that we would have gotten there if we hadn't done these seed investments, so to speak, over the years. So this is my take, even in the less developed countries, in terms of where we are in terms of welfare and meat reduction. I think putting aside a little bit of your time to touch on these topics, even though you might not see them go anywhere right now, but kind of plant the seeds, I think it's a good idea.
So what kind of time frameworks do you put for planting the seeds? How fast do you
That really depends. I think in Germany, we got lucky that a couple of things just came together. The general public conversation shifted in that direction. Like some companies, I think, some of the decision makers just care to some degree, at least, or they at least see things coming and they want to be more on the forefront. So I think it's, you plant the seeds, but as with seeds, it depends on the overall conditions, right? Does it rain enough? Does it rain too much? Is there enough sunlight, etc.? So just if you feel like you can have initial conversations with companies about this, and just every once in a while say something like, hey, we think the way forward is to increase welfare standards. That obviously makes the animal products a little bit more expensive. So we think also decreasing the animal side of things over time, that goes hand in hand nicely, and you get people to nod after they hear the third time. And that's kind of the pathway forward, I think. Even if you start from zero, I think this is something you should or could start doing now.
Cool. One more area of the day-to-day work, and you briefly touched with your structure hack on it, and I want to talk a bit more about the communication. As you said, like you're not only working behind the scenes in Germany, but I think it's I would say most of your approach is like being very collaborative and cooperative with companies, and you hard like it's the last resort to launch a campaign. Can you elaborate a bit more about why this approach and what makes companies want to talk to you? Because it seems like all is very easy. Probably it isn't. So reveal the secret, please.
Yeah, I think no major secrets. I like the phrase, there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of lead bullets only, even though that's kind of an aggressive way to frame it. But I think a lot of things have come together. I think it's smart to think about the overall movement design. So when you're working in a country, look at what the other groups are doing, what are the niches, what isn't really covered well. To me, it was very obvious when I started working at ASF, nobody was doing corporate outreach. And also maybe that's kind of my nature to just not go totally aggressive, but to find win-win situations. It's just kind of how I'm wired. So I was like, why not try this? And I had done this as a student with universities and get them to go cage-free. And it was mostly constructive. And if it didn't work, we would collect signatures, stuff like that. And it was still kind of friendly, pushy, and not too aggressive. I was like, why not bring this approach to a huge retailer? And it did work. And they were willing to talk about this. We always we made it very clear that we are serious about the stuff we are proposing. We're not like, it would be awesome to have a meeting about this. And even if it has no results, maybe talking about it is good. We are very clear about what we want, where we want the industry to be heading. And we show kind of realistic scenarios where things can go. And I think the being realistic part is extremely important. Like when you have asks that just don't make sense to a company, maybe you shouldn't bring that up, or you should split the ask into smaller steps. Yeah, and just being reasonable, being professional about what you do, being kind of open about the approach you choose. So even if you decide that campaigns are part of what you will be doing, be transparent about wanting to be collaborative, and explain that if you launch a campaign, that it's like the last resort. And I think it would be even better to have a movement design where that could be totally separated, where you have just a very cooperative good cop and then a more aggressive organization doing the campaigning. That was not the case in Germany, so we built a campaigns team for that reason. And we get it to kind of work. Sometimes we see some downsides to it. But yeah, so movement design, being reasonable. And also what I've seen over the years, maybe some organizations saying, hey, we want to do corporate work now. So they all of a sudden have 2 or 3 corporate outreaches, and they try to talk to all these companies. Obviously, first thing they hear is, well, we already talked to our Schweitzer Foundation because we had the first mover advantage. Then maybe it takes them 1 or 2 years to build some good relationships. And then they decide to go another way. Or some people resign and they don't fill the slots again. And then they have built up some relations for a couple of years, and it all kind of vanishes into nothingness. And then 5 years later, they want to pick it up again. They start from zero again. So I think if you want to do this kind of work, be serious about it. Make sure you have long-term resources for it. Make sure you're staffed for it. Make sure you have people who know what they're talking about, who are good at talking to companies, who have maybe a bit of a salesy background that can be helpful if it's not like pushy salesy, but reasonable, let's get somewhere salesy in a way. Yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask some questions from the audience, and I will save one from my list for the very end. Okay, so one from Pavel. How do you evaluate the impact of your plant-based programs? How do you make sure it translates into reduction of animal suffering? Karla, you want to start?
Sure. So certainly in thinking about this, when we we're looking at welfare reform and reducing overall suffering, also then reducing the number of animals even born into factory farms and thinking about that reducing as well. So that's where more of our plant-based side comes in tracking a lot of that information. So I would say certainly where we're at right now is tracking our ultimate goals when it comes to our plant-based and meat reduction. So that is right now getting the industry to 50% plant-based. So we have in place the scorecards like I referenced, that data collection. Now we're able to get the actual purchasing data from these companies. We also have been for many years working with environmental consultant that does life cycle assessments for companies that are motivated by those changes. So that's additional data as well. So what we have is a lot of internal tracking in terms of, for the United States, how many animals are purchased within the specific industry that we're looking at within food service so that we can estimate based on the changes that we're making and that reduction in purchasing, comparing those numbers.
Mahi?
We are kind of non-nerdy about this, so we're doing the obvious. Working towards goals, companies setting goals for where they want to go on the protein shift, making that happen, making sure we don't do stupid things like have a lot more chicken meat than beef. And we don't do calculations about how many animals we think will be saved. I think we would be way off sometimes. So then we would have funders who do the math in different ways. And luckily our large funders are fine with them doing the math because they want to do it. And we just say, hey, we got company X to commit to this over a time frame of 2 years or whatever. And then they do their own calculus and inform them.
So you basically trust companies to some extent.
Well, we do want to see that they meet their goals. We do ask for reports on where they're going. And on the plant-based side, we're just starting this. But on the welfare sides, obviously, we want the annual reports, for instance, for broiler progress. And for meat reduction and plant-based stuff, we also want to see progress reports. But that's enough for us, and then we don't get too nerdy about it.
One more for you, just to maybe quick answer to a question to elaborate on what protein mix measurement means. That was a question from Christian. So.
Yeah, very interesting question. It can be super complicated. By now, we have 3 different systems in Germany alone of how it's done. So the WWF came out with a way to calculate a protein split in a company. And I'm not sure if I get this 100% right, but they kind of measure how much animal and plant-based protein is in different products. And then they allocate kind of a score and percentage over the supply chain. There's a more simple approach. It's called the protein tracker, where you have plant-based on one side, animal-based on the other side, and then products that have a mix that are just for simplifying reasons seen as 50-50, plant-based, animal-based. So that's calculated. And now Aldi came up with their own system saying we're not only looking at proteins, we're looking at all products. And so we want to include fruits and vegetables, for instance, and we want to make sure people eat more fruits and vegetables. So we want to measure that as well. And there's a debate about how to actually do it and what kind of way to measure things will have the biggest impact for the animals. And that's still ongoing. And my worry is, or my sign of caution is, even if we have our favorite method, the market might decide to do their own thing anyway. I think I would prioritize everyone using the same method so we can compare it more easily and have rankings. And in Germany, at least, a lot of companies care about when we do rankings, where they land and what rank. So yeah, this is my take on measurement.
Yeah, there's some alignment in the Netherlands where I think like a couple of retailers committed to use the same protein tracking. I think it's pretty cool. Yeah. Karla, super interesting question from Kirsty. Are there any mistakes that you think the US plant-based movement has made that you'd want the European movement to learn from, or maybe to avoid as well?
I would say the first thing that comes to mind, and thank you for that question. I mean, I think we're constantly evaluating what we're doing and the work that we're doing. So I can only speak to the work that HSUS has done. And I would say the only mistake that we made early on was providing our technical assistance. So I have a team of chefs that much of our work on the plant-based side is culinary focused when working with many of these companies. So recipe development, culinary training, a lot of that support. We were initially offering that support on good faith without any kind of commitment or actual tracking for what the company was hoping to do with those resources. So I would say certainly, you know, if you have the ability, I know not all organizations focus on that particular lane, but I would say no matter what on plant-based is to have that alignment on the expectation that you want from the company and the ask.
Cool. Okay, I have one more that is pretty interesting. There are more, but I'll ask one from Erwin. Do you think that the same strategy as the meat and dairy industry is having in politics, like aligning and representing producers and farmers' interests, would be useful for plant-based food industry and animal welfare NGOs? So I assume like the unions and projects alike. On the, do you mean on a political level or general economical level?
It's for me?
Yeah, you can try.
Yeah, I see some value in that. And I think getting appointments with politicians, it helps if you have kind of an association or group of companies or NGOs behind you, especially if you're not that large or established yet. And yeah, we see that we have that in Germany and Europe to some extent. And yeah, I think it makes sense. And also it helps with smaller companies who may not have the resources to have a dedicated team to do political work, to just pool their resources and to together hire a team to do that kind of work. So yeah, anything in that direction I'm generally excited about, with kind of the side note that this kind of work requires a lot of patience. If you want to have political progress, you can't expect overnight victories. And that's what I like about the corporate work, that sometimes you can actually have these overnight wins.
Karla?
Yeah, I would say from the US side, we're very fortunate to have teams. So we do have a legislative side where we are working on state legislation for welfare reforms and also federal, any kind of federal legislation that comes up. We're primarily focused on the welfare side of it. There are other NGOs and organizations that do more of the plant-based where we can sign on and support in that way. We also do work closely with companies in terms of sign-on letters and other, as well as producers and support. So I think there's a lot of value when it comes to the legislative side. But would agree, it's definitely a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, we've seen some traction also in Poland when we launched the union, that it also shifts the perception of who is actually sitting at the table. If you represent the business side of things, at least like in Poland, the government kind of wants to talk with you a bit more than if you're just an advocate. Yeah, one very interesting question that relates to what you said, Mahi, about launching a campaign against Lidl at the time where Lidl also presented their protein mix strategy. Do you think that animal welfare organizations should have plant-based campaigns, or would it be easier to just have two different organizations, one for animal welfare and another one only for the plant-based movement? Yeah.
So that question, I would clearly say that it can have huge benefits to do both at once. At least for us, it has been fantastic. We started with easy welfare asks that the companies really understood. We immediately had open doors to walk through. We got a seat at the table, and we were able to kind of bring more and more topics. We even got asked the question, what else is on your list? So If you are working in a situation where plant-based is still very difficult, I think it can be a huge advantage if welfare is more accepted as an ask to go.
That is very interesting, actually, that you started from welfare and then got the plant-based.
Yeah. And I would say if you want to split things up, I would rather think about good cop and bad cop being split up and having groups that are really constructively working with companies and building a lot of trust, building those relationships over many, many years. And then other groups who just can be more aggressive and push for things. And I do think, at least for Germany, we are getting to a point where we can actually start pushing companies on plant-based stuff. Now with 2 of the 4 largest retailers actively involved in this and some other companies also involved in this kind of work, you can start going to the competitors and say, hey, what's up? Why aren't you doing anything? And maybe start even pressuring them on this.
Karla, you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, so I would, for the most part, really agree with what Mahi said. And I think, one thing that we've seen is that in the United States, we certainly have a lot of that situation where there are other organizations that are pushing companies more so. We oftentimes will have companies come to us when they're receiving pressure from other organizations asking to help, whether it's reform or plant-based as well. So I think that there is a big benefit in still continuing both within that, and would still, for organizations that are committed to that, would encourage that.
Yeah, I'm always thinking if as a welfare organization we are spreading ourselves too thin, doing like a lot of things, or it's a kind of a portfolio strategy where you put your investments in a couple of different areas. Yeah. Now a provocative question. If you were to choose just one intervention, I know you love those kind of questions, to focus for the next couple of years, what would that be? Karla, maybe you want to start? And you can be completely agnostic of your current work.
Oh, okay. I would say I still would lean to, if I was to focus on for the US, I would focus on the plant-based meat reduction. I feel like over the last few years, we have seen such a momentum, and I would hate not to fall back on any of that. I think we just need to capitalize on it and continue moving forward. So if forced with both options, that's what I would choose.
Cool.
I would choose relationship building, and I just don't see why and
spreading love.
It just doesn't make sense to me to just do welfare or plant-based. I just don't see any reasoning why we should do that. But if I, for instance, had to choose between relationship building and campaigns, I would with one kind of crying eye decide to do relationship building.
Cool. And I think I'll have one last question for you. As you're both super experienced leaders, what would be a word of wisdom from you as organizational leaders to other leaders who are building organizations or building campaigns in making strategic campaigning decisions? Yeah.
I'm happy to kick things off.
You're super ready, super prepared.
I would say first, I think, and I believe Mahi kind of mentioned this at some point in his discussion, but if you are really building strategy and thinking about your particular region or countries, I would see what is the landscape, really kind of look and see what are other organizations doing already. Are there any gaps to fill? Are there any other resources that you can plug into and start developing strategy in that way and focusing on that? I think, another piece of this, and I know you only mentioned one, but I'll add a few others here, but just constantly reevaluating and really assessing the work that you're doing and not sticking to one intervention or one tactic just because that's what you're doing, thinking about how can we go beyond that, or are there other strategies that are more effective And then I would just also say, no matter what, in thinking about it, don't be afraid to set large, audacious goals for the fear of failure, because even if we don't reach that goal, just thinking about the massive number of animals that we are going to impact if you get even somewhat close to your goal is also really important. So I think don't be afraid to set large goals.
Mahi.
So my wisdom is limited. Thank you, Karla. Those were some great points. I'm not sure if I have anything to add to what I already said today. Maybe one thing to emphasize is to really focus on winnable objectives. I think is a huge danger if you don't make any progress for many years to burn out completely. And I think the only reason why I'm still going after 16 years is that every single year we achieve meaningful results. And that's by design, because we, in our strategy, look at what are the next low-hanging fruits, or what are the next opportunities for us, for the movement, where can we make progress. And that has led to, like, every year we get something done, at least. Like, not every year is fantastic, but there's no year of us having to say, okay, we kind of messed this one up, or we dropped the ball, or we kind of just didn't get anything done. I think this is super important, to look at what you can actually win, or at least make some progress, and keep building on that. And as I mentioned, that can lead to your supporter base growing, to your donations growing, and your influence growing over time. And just everybody, your team, the companies you work with, maybe the politicians you work with, the media you work with, they all get used to what you want to happen actually happens over time. Maybe not as fast as you want it to happen, but it's just kind of, it becomes normalized. And if you have too high goals, or you choose an intervention that is basically hopeless, you will not build that kind of upward going spiral. So I'd really focus on that.
Yeah, so being bold, but reaching for what's reachable. Yeah, that would be like a combination of what you both said. A round of applause. Karla Dumas, Mahi Klosterhalfen. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and it's been a pleasure. And please reach out to those smart people. They are still here for the next 2 days. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming in such a high quantity. Hope it was insightful. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.